the phones are doing it to train you as a consumer. We don't engage our brain and do critical thinking and say, is that true? Trying to scare people.
And that goes back to the cholesterol.
All the brain waves really come from the machinery inside a cell.
Because frequency makes sound. Dr. Michael Pierce, welcome.
Thank you, Lily.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about brainwaves today. So first of all, can you just tell me what brainwaves are and what do they tell us about our body?
They're electromagnetic ripples that come out of your brain cells, and they easily make it through your skull and escape. They don't go very far, and they're pretty weak, but they can tell us a lot about what our brain is doing. For every other illness, every other organ, every other specialist, if you go to a cardiologist, if you go to a kidney doctor, they measure the organ. But when you go to a psychiatrist, they don't measure the organ. They ask you a series of questions, and they put you in a category based on the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And that just basically is a list of lists that helps you figure out what your psychological condition is. They don't measure the brain. So I think that EEG is a really exciting way of understanding what the brain is actually doing at rest. And it's very, very important to understand that it's at rest. It's not doing anything. There's other tests for action, but the resting state of the brain is an EEG. So that's really important.
Okay. And what are the different types of brainwaves?
Low frequency that range up to high frequency, and generally the slower ones are more related to sleep and restoration. They're related to healing and recovery, and then the faster you get, the more they cross into consciousness, and they become very high levels of consciousness, like being able to take a final exam or answer tough questions, or maybe testify in court, or like take a final exam in college is a good example of the higher frequency brainwaves where you're really trying to figure out what's going on. Maybe if you're trying to do an escape game, one of those escape room things that people do where they try to escape from an escape room, that would be a fast frequency. But most of us live in our awake state in right in the middle, called alpha waves. And that's right in the middle between kind of being asleep or obtunded or kind of, unconscious and very, very active, kind of like standing in line for a coffee. You're waiting and you're alert, but you're not very alert. You're certainly not hyper vigilant. And so that's the state most of us spend when we're just kind of, standing around doing nothing, but we're awake and we're not asleep and we're not lying down.
Okay. So are alpha waves the waves that we are mostly in throughout the entire day?
Yeah, we have there's something called peak alpha frequency, which is kind of our resting brainwave state, which kind of tells us how fast is our brain idling. And some people have faster brainwave states, alpha wave states, than others. And so that means that they just kind of idle faster, and often they're smarter. It doesn't necessarily mean that smart people always have fast alpha peaks, but it's very highly correlated that higher intelligence has faster alpha waves, and that as you age, you lose just a little bit as the decades go by. But if you're healthy, you don't have to lose much at all.
That's good. That's interesting. What are the other types of brainwaves?
We'll start at the bottom. The delta waves are the slowest ones that we measure on EEG, and there are certainly slower waves than that, which I'll get to. But delta waves are classified as about 1 to 3 cycles per second, so they're kind of like an ocean swell, and they're the waves of deep sleep. We often talk about delta sleep or deep wave sleep. And if you've got mostly delta waves, you're asleep, if that's what we see on the EEG. The next one up is theta waves, and those are a little faster, like 4 to 8, 4 to 7 cycles per second. And those are very obtunded, very like between sleep and awake when you're falling asleep. The theta waves are the waves of falling asleep. If you see a lot of theta waves, that person is really pretty slow. If you see a lot of theta waves, they're really slowed down. They're nearly asleep. And then alpha waves are just that kind of regular, relaxed, chill brain wave. And then beta waves begin, and beta waves are a fairly long range. They range from, alpha waves are about 8 to 12, and then beta waves are 12 to about 30 cycles per second. And so those are clipping along pretty fast, and you don't really get beta waves until you grow up to be about, 7 or 8 years old.
Oh, wow.
And I think the analogy that I like to say about that is, if we had a kid in front of us that was maybe 5 years old and wasn't making many beta waves, they're mostly making theta and dream state alpha waves because they're 5 years old. We couldn't hand them a sharp kitchen knife or hand them a lit match. It would be disaster. But if we took a 9-year-old and handed them a kitchen knife and said, cut some vegetables, or here's a lit match, light a fire, they could largely do that. and they could cross a street, and they can open a door, and they can send email. They can do all kinds of things because their brain is matured enough to make these fast beta waves. And so
Mm.
the beta waves range from lower beta to middle beta to higher beta, and they are various levels of intensity. So, if you're just answering emails or text messages or riding your bike, they're going to be kind of low level. But I like to think of beta waves as waves that deal with consequences. Anything that you do that might have a consequence, like, oh, I might drop something on my foot, or I might crash my bike, or I might cut my finger. Anything that deals with a consequence is probably going to need a beta wave frequency because it has to be fast enough to show you, oh boy, I better be careful. And then the very fastest that we measure is gamma. And gamma
Mm.
we don't see very often. Gamma is mysterious, it's very fast, and there's certainly waves way faster than gamma that we can't measure with typical equipment. We need
Mm.
special equipment to measure. And those are ultra fast waves that are super far beyond gamma. But at least gamma waves are, well above 30 cycles per second. And those are the waves of intense action and intense thought, and things, like I said, very stressful and intense thinking, where you're really trying to use your brain as hard as you can. And those are involved in altered states sometimes, and even monks that meditate
Mm.
have highly advanced levels of gamma synchrony, and they meditate on compassion, and yet they have these high gamma wave states.
Whoa, that's interesting. So, but you said so there's waves that are higher frequency than gamma and lower frequency than delta, but we can't measure them?
Yeah, the devices that we typically use, and these are fairly expensive devices, they can be, 20 to $50,000 or more, and some of them are portable and some of them are not. And you see them in neurological offices and psychological offices and chiropractic offices. I have several, and they pick up your brain waves from delta up to about gamma, but they can't
Mhm.
really do much more above gamma. And
Mm.
they some of them will go below delta and do infraslow or infralow, which is less than 1 cycle per second, and that's very interesting. It's kind of a newish thing over the last 10 or 20 years in neurofeedback.
Okay. Huh, interesting. And back to beta waves, you said that we develop beta waves, like we unlock beta waves after we turn about 7.
Yeah, as you
So
mature.
so could that be why, kids have such a high imagination and maybe they're not able to focus as well?
Yeah, they're basically high. They're like a high adult because they haven't had enough myelin, which is the cholesterol plaque, or it's not plaque, but it's a sheath that surrounds your nerve fibers. It's just like the wire
Okay.
insulation around a wire. These
Yeah.
these plastic wires that we use. The
Right.
insulation around neurons makes them fire faster. So if you want to have faster firing, you need to have you need to lay down all this cholesterol, and that's part of what children do, is they lay down this cholesterol fat around their nerves, and when they don't do it, they get problems with learning. It's one of the biggest problems in children in the United States, is that we don't have enough cholesterol and omega-3s and natural saturated fats, and so children mature more slowly because they don't lay down this myelin sheath around their neurons.
Wow, that is so interesting. I've always heard cholesterol being talked about in a negative light, like you have too
Yeah.
much cholesterol.
Yeah. It's unfortunately, we really don't understand. Well, cholesterol is understood. There's been kind of a industry capture of cholesterol and heart disease and brain function that really says if you eat cholesterol, that's bad and you're going to get heart disease. And
Mhm.
it's wrong. And it's been wrong since the 1950s, when
Wow.
Ansel Keys first published his 7 country study, where he falsified some information and plagiarized some work, and he cherry picked some stuff from different European countries, and he said these 7 countries have high fat diets and they have heart disease. And so that's where heart disease comes from. And that was in the 1950s. And ever since then, industry has owned and pushed this. And it's been falsified since the very year he published it, because people knew that he was cherry picking from 35 countries, and it was wrong from the beginning. I mean, Eskimos and Inuits ate 60% fat, and it was mostly blubber.
Mhm. Right.
So
Wow.
don't tell me that. And they didn't have heart attacks, and they didn't have strokes, and they didn't have cancer and diabetes. They didn't have that stuff until the white man brought their food.
Oh my goodness, that is so amazing. Wow. Okay, so we need cholesterol. Cholesterol is good for us.
Dietary cholesterol is good for us. Cholesterol in your plaquing in your arteries is bad, and that's
Mhm.
caused by fructose. It's caused by high fructose corn sweetener. It's caused by artificial sweeteners. It's caused by excess glucose and excess sugar and excess carbs in a diet. That's what
Wow.
causes the inflammation that makes the deposition of cholesterol in your arteries, not by eating cholesterol. In fact, eating
Wow.
cholesterol will lower the cholesterol in your arteries.
Oh my gosh. Wow, you're blowing my mind right now. That's so cool. So the different brain waves, are they prevalent in different areas of the brain?
Oh yes. Yeah, there's you tend to have more of the alpha waves in the back of your head, especially when your eyes are closed.
Okay.
And you tend to have more beta waves in the front of your brain and your frontal lobes where you do your real heavy thinking. So there tends to be a real bias of alpha in the back and beta in the front.
Okay, interesting. And back to beta waves not developing until you're over 7. People say that your prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until you're around 25, and beta waves are in the prefrontal cortex.
Oh yeah.
So, there is a correlation there that when you're older, you develop stronger beta waves or something?
Well, I've actually caught a lot of flack online for that statement because people have accused me of saying that that young people are stupid and that anybody under 25 is dumb. And that's
Mhm.
not at all what I had said or intended. What I was talking about was the literature that talks about myelin deposition. And it shows that really myelin deposition isn't finished until largely you're 25 years old, about when you get your 25-year molars. So
Okay.
your skeleton isn't finished until you're 25 because you don't have your last teeth, and your brain isn't quite finished till you're 25 because you don't have your last bits of myelin that are in the farthest reaches of your brain. So it doesn't mean that you're some immature idiot. It just means that your brain isn't quite done laying down all those different things it needs to do until you're 25. And that is partly why some young people begin to get much more mature in their mid 20s than they were, say, in their early 20s or their late teens, and they can be very volatile. This is the Shakespearean story of Romeo and Juliet. you know, um, People that have passed puberty, but that are still not really emotionally mature and ready for life sometimes can have problems if they have problems with this myelin. And in fact, if teenagers and young people that are in their early 20s don't get enough natural cholesterol and omega-3s, they will be immature and they will make rash decisions and they will hurt themselves.
Wow, so our diet has a huge role in this. And our diet, especially in America, is all high fructose corn syrup and all these sugars. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. So if we change our diet, then that could possibly help us get more cholesterol and more omega-3 that would help develop the myelin in surrounding our neurons.
Yes, yes.
Wow. Okay. So interesting. So myelin, you said, just to be clear, so I make sure that I understand, myelin, am I saying it correctly?
Yeah, myelin, yep.
Okay. It is the substance that surrounds our neurons.
Yes.
Okay. And that helps our neurons fire faster?
Yeah, yeah. When you have this layer of insulation around nerve cells, they fire much faster. It allows them to essentially skip. The nerves fire by something called saltatory conduction, which is a big mouthful, and it simply means that sodium crosses into the cell and then back out, and we've got this pump that tries to bail it out and keep it out all the time. And then when we need to fire an action potential, which is a message, we need to be ready, almost like having a loaded gun that's ready to fire a missile, or rather like a flare gun that's ready to fire a signal, so that we're always ready. So we always want to load that gun and fire it. And the gaps that happen with how far down a nerve fiber can be conducted can be skipped when it's wrapped in this fatty layer. And this
Mm.
fatty layer makes it able to just fire so much faster down the line of allowing salt into the cell so that the cell can fire orders of magnitude faster than it can without this coating.
And right, and so that therefore it helps us with our beta waves because beta waves are a higher frequency.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And beta waves, they help us focus for long periods of time.
Yep.
What else do they help us do?
Well, they help us with complexity. They help us with deeper thinking.
Okay.
If you've ever had kind of woken up very slowly and you're kind of sluggish, your brain isn't really firing a lot of beta waves, and you feel kind of like you can't comprehend simple stuff like, wait a minute, where is my toothbrush? That
Yeah.
kind of feeling of being fuzzy. A
Uh-huh.
lot of people talk about brain fog, and they just don't have healthy, organized beta waves, and that's one of the things we look for in EEG when we measure the brain waves.
Okay, so they help us with as well with our impulsivity, and that's something that's characterized as, when you're under 25, after 25, you're less impulsive.
Yeah, and don't forget, sometimes you'll see people even under 25, which with excess beta waves, which can often manifest as anxiety or
Wow.
inflammation chemically, or even sometimes hypervigilance. If you've got some PTSD, you can be hypervigilant and have excess beta waves because you're just so vigilant from a PTSD experience.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's fast. Too many beta waves can be as bad as too few beta waves.
So, can beta waves be consciously controlled? I mean, brain
All
waves,
of the
yeah.
waves can be controlled. And it's when you say consciously controlled, it's kind of weird. We call it intrinsic learning. If I was to do extrinsic learning with you and we sit down and we did some math, and maybe I taught you how to do some math, or you taught me how to do some math, which is more likely, and I could then tell somebody how she taught me to do this math, or how she taught me this language, or how she taught me something,
Yeah.
I can explain it. But intrinsic learning is not something you can really teach. So when you do neurofeedback and you've got your brain hooked up to electrodes and you're training yourself to change your brain waves, you don't really know how you do it. You just kind of relax into it and it happens. And it happens naturally. And you don't know how to explain what you did. So was it conscious? Well, yeah, you were conscious when you did it, and you don't do it unless you're conscious. So you would say that yes, it was a conscious learning, but it wasn't really something we can explain. So we
Mm,
call that, intrinsic versus extrinsic types of learning, or implicit versus explicit learning.
okay.
It's not very clear what I did or how I did it, but I changed those brain waves on that screen.
Okay, and so you just do it through your thoughts, like thinking to myself, "I want to be in a slower or a higher frequency state."
Yeah, in fact, when I teach people, and I've taught thousands of people to do neurofeedback, I just tell them, you know what? The system in front of you is going to make a sound or flash a light when you do the right thing that we want. And so you don't really have to do anything except relax and let it happen, because your brain wants the dopamine that gets released every time you see the light flash or the sound beep. Every time you get that reward, you're going to get a little bit of dopamine, and you're going to learn to make the right brainwave that we want to make in you. So you don't really have to do much except let it happen. It's the dark side of this is your phones, and your phones are a lot like a slot machine. When you use your cell phone, and it gives you these beeps and these flashing lights and rewards, that gives you a bit of a dopamine hit. It makes you more addicted to your social media. So we have to work away from that when we do neurofeedback, and we have to help people, turn off their phones and get away from that constant reward of light and sound, because we use the same method in neurofeedback to train better brain waves, but the phones are doing it to train you as a consumer.
Oh my gosh. Yes, and so whenever we get those dopamine hits, that is fueling our addiction.
Well, it's fueling our learning, and sometimes that learning is addiction, and sometimes that learning is good. It's
Mhm.
called good or bad plasticity, or good or bad. They used to call it facilitation in the old days, but facilitation was making a pathway more strong, and inhibition was making it less strong. Today we call it plasticity, but there's good and bad plasticity. You can
Okay.
build new pathways in your brain that are healthy, or you can
Right.
build ones that are really addictive and unhealthy. Absolutely.
Right, okay. Just like when you're thinking positively or negatively, then you're creating those thought patterns and it can either be negative or positive.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay, so the dopamine from our phone is creating new pathways in our brain, making
Yep.
us addicted. Okay.
And
Yeah.
it's strengthening the ones that we're into. It's kind of a rut. They strengthen these pathways until we get really entrenched in them, and we can't do without watching, the mainstream news, or we can't do without watching some propaganda or something that we're addicted to. And we don't engage our brain and do critical thinking and say, is that true? Is that really what happened in the world?
Right. Right. We are losing our critical thinking skills, that's for sure. What are the implications of abnormal brainwave patterns as we see in neurological diseases such as epilepsy?
Well, epilepsy specifically tends to have these paroxysms, which is these little moments of kind of zap, like, "Eh." And so those moments have spike and wave patterns, or they have fast wave spikes, spike trains, where they've got very irregular electrical activity that's much more than typical, much more voltage, much more power, much more electrical energy. Temporal lobe is much more likely than any other lobe to get epilepsy, and some believe that that's because of the way the temporal lobe is constructed. There's some parts of the temporal lobe that are more primitive, and so some people believe that that's why. It's unclear why, but but that's something that happens. There's also slow wave epilepsy where people have too much delta waves. There's a burst of delta or a burst of theta, and they just kind of, have like an absent seizure where they're just not there. So you can have fast
Mm.
wave seizures and slow wave seizures, and you
Oh.
can have focal or broad seizures, and you'll see them, all those types, on the brain waves.
What are focal and broad seizures?
So focal would be one spot where there's just
Oh,
one area of
okay.
electrical disturbance, and the rest of the brain is electrically normal. And broad would be the whole brain is misfiring with excess punch, and that we usually call encephalopathy typically.
Okay. And so the faster seizures, those are firing from brainwaves firing at a higher frequency or
Yeah, you'll see some seizures that are more fast wave seizures, and they tend to involve they don't always involve this, but they tend to involve more motor activity where the person is twitching or clenching,
right.
or they're folded up,
Yeah.
versus many of the slow wave seizures that they tend to just make the person just zone out where they're just not there, and they have super slow brain waves, and they can even in some cases be catatonic where they're just frozen in space, like they're frozen.
Yeah.
And those are a basal ganglia disorder, which is a little different, but the general idea is that you've got slow and fast wave types of seizures and epilepsies.
Okay. And so if there was a way for us to control our brainwaves, then we could limit the amount of seizures that a person gets if they're epileptic.
Sometimes some seizures are environmental, and they're caused by poisons in the environment. Some seizures are caused by concussions and head injuries, and some are highly genetic and they're inherited. um, uh, Neurofeedback tries to reduce that with neurofeedback, and it's getting safer as the years go by. Originally, it was kind of frowned upon, people, and that was partly industry driven. The drug industry didn't want people to compete with them and use natural methods, but
Yeah.
it's very interesting, and sometimes neurofeedback can really reduce seizure disorders and help control seizure disorders. Now, there are medications that are used, and some people do very poorly on those medications, and other people do quite well. So it's not just an open and shut case to say, well, we have medications for seizure now. Well, in centuries past, in eons past, thousands of years, people used ketogenic diets. They've been written about since the Romans.
Mm.
Ketogenic diets and fatty diets with more fat.
Yeah.
We're talking about, thousands of years ago.
And that goes back to the cholesterol
Yep.
possibly helping. Okay. And
Exactly.
so all in all, seizures are abnormalities in our brainwaves.
Yes.
Okay. Interesting. And what is neurofeedback?
Well, neurofeedback is where we use electrodes on somebody's head, usually, to pick up their brain waves, to report to some kind of machine, and the
Mhm.
machine reports to the person a reward, helping them gravitate toward the desired brain waves. So if you've got a brain wave that we don't like, we can either train it down and have you stop doing it, or we can train up another brain wave that you don't make enough of, or
Mhm.
both. And we can do it simultaneously now with fast computers. In the original days, before computers, you really just had like one electrode, and it would go to a light bulb, and it would measure one brainwave in one spot. So if I was
Mm.
measuring alpha waves on the back of my head, and that's all I was measuring, and I wanted that one spot to have more alpha waves, the light would flash when I made enough alpha waves. And then that would be my neurofeedback. But today we can train this area up alpha and this area down beta and this up and this, and we can do all kinds of stuff simultaneously. And the only limit is your brain. How much can your brain handle? And we can do simultaneously 2, 3, 4, 5 things at a time, and the brain can handle it just by listening to sound and seeing light and turning this up and turning that down, all somewhat subconsciously.
Wow, super interesting. And that machine or thing is the thing that's over your head with a bunch of wires sticking out, or is
Yeah,
that
so there's really two kinds of wires that would go on your head. There's the kind that are imaging, which are the ones that are showing your brain waves and not really doing something to you therapeutically. And we usually call that EEG. EEG is electroencephalography. It's measuring the brain waves at rest. Now there's another
Mhm.
one that's done under task, which is called ERP, which is event related potentials. And that's where we flash pictures at you, or we play sounds for you, and we ask you to respond and hit a mouse or hit a keyboard when you see something change and it breaks a pattern. And when you do that, that's an active type of thing, and that's less talked about in the common world, but in neurology, it's pretty well understood. Now, if you want to change somebody's brain and not just measure it, you do neurofeedback, and that's where you attach one or two or a whole bunch of
Mhm.
electrodes to somebody's head, and you're measuring it, and you're also giving them some feedback that says, hey, you're doing what we want, or hey, you're not doing so much what we want. And that helps a person change their brain waves very rapidly, and over time change their output.
And theta waves, you said that they were slower, right?
Yep.
And they are the ones that they're a little bit faster than delta waves. So
Hmm.
they're the ones that we go into like before we're going to sleep. Do they help us get into our subconscious mind and potentially change our thought patterns that are ingrained into our subconscious mind?
Yeah, when people meditate or they pray and they get in a very deep state where they're almost falling asleep, they're in a theta wave state.
Mhm.
When people smoke too much pot, or they have way too much alcohol, or they have sometimes head injuries, or sleep disorders, sometimes they make too many of these theta waves. And
Okay.
and and they often fall asleep and awake. They're kind of in and out of a sleep because they drop into delta a little bit. It's hard.
Mhm.
Theta is a transition, so it's really hard
Okay.
to stay in theta because people really kind of fall in and out of sleep, and you'll see them
Mm.
going into sleep, and that's of course going to be delta.
Okay, and that's why I've heard it's good to play meditations when you're sleeping because it goes into your subconscious brain.
Yeah, there's things you can learn, and things you can hear, and things that can happen to you in your theta state when you're transitioning into sleep. And in fact, mineral deficiencies like boron deficiency affect your theta transition in and out of sleep. And sometimes you may have been falling asleep, and you've had a feel or a sensation or a dream where you suddenly shock and feel like maybe somebody hit you with a baseball bat, or you
Yeah.
fell from a height and you suddenly wake up. And that's a K complex wake up that happens. It's a disorder of sleep transition, and it's often caused by boron deficiencies or other deficiencies of minerals that have to do with how the theta waves work.
Okay, interesting. And the sleep, is it sleep apnea? No, it's okay, sleep paralysis. Does that have something to do with problems with theta or delta waves?
Well, certainly there are a number of brain waves that will show up in sleep disorders. Now, I'm not a sleep fellow trained physician. I have a specialty in EEG for essentially awake adults and young people, but I don't have the early childhood neonatal training. I don't have the sleep lab training. I don't have that kind of training. That's a specialty, and much of the sleep disorders are in the brain stem. So, when you look at the brain, I've got one right here. This is a plastic one.
Cool.
This thing right in the middle is the brainstem, and it's behind this blood vessel right here. So that's the brainstem. And this is
Okay.
the brain. When we measure brain waves, we're measuring the surface of the brain. We're measuring all this tan stuff, and the green back here is the cerebellum. We can't measure that. That's too deep and too small, and the cells aren't the right shape, and they don't make good waves that we can pick up. We
Mm.
cannot pick up the brainstem either, and that's where a lot of sleep disorder problems originate. So
Oh.
it's a little different. You'll certainly see some brain waves, and sometimes those sleep disorders can be helped with neurofeedback. But sometimes they need a sleep disorder physician who's got a fellowship trained, specialty in sleep disorder analysis. And you go to a sleep lab and you sleep there with the cap on your head,
Mm.
measuring your brain waves.
How do external factors such as music, meditation, or hypnosis modulate different brainwave patterns?
Well, you can do a lot with your brain waves by doing those things. You can modulate them toward an alpha state, or change which alpha frequency you're at. You
Mm.
can modulate your brain waves quite a bit with those things, and the more you practice it, the better you can get at it. I think in time there will be brainwave devices that are cheap enough that they hook up to your phone, and you'll be able to play with your own brain waves without spending as much money as it costs now to do an EEG with the proper equipment. You'll be able to have essentially a home version where you can experiment with, gosh, what does my meditation do to my brain waves? And you can look at it yourself.
Wow. That would be so cool. So you explained how the different brain waves are certain frequencies. So if we play that frequency, let's say we go on YouTube and we say 12 hertz. What brainwave is 12 hertz again?
Well,
Beta?
12 is the transition between alpha and beta. It's that
Okay.
division between alpha and beta. And so when you play those frequencies, there is a tendency for your brain to entrain that a little bit, and that's called entrainment. That's where you
Mhm.
use light and sound at a certain frequency to try to make your brain a certain speed, and that has some effects. I think neurofeedback with the wires is probably more direct, but it's certainly good and safe and fun and useful to do those entrainment methods where you change the frequency of light or sound Some people are fragile and they've been injured in their brainstem or their brain and they can't handle those and they kind of freak out. And that's fairly normal if you've had brain injuries and problems, and you just need to find a chiropractic neurologist or somebody that knows how to treat those things to help them, because not everybody can tolerate um, light and sound frequencies as a therapy.
Mm,
They sometimes really react to them badly, but they also can react good. They can do a lot of good too. I don't want to say that they're bad. They're just
yeah.
bad for a certain group of people that are injured.
Right. Okay. So if we wanted to focus really hard or study for a long period of time, then we could play beta waves.
Yeah, you can change your music frequencies of all types. You can very much modulate and tune the music that you're listening to or the lights that you're watching into quite intensive light shows and audio programming to make your brain to help your brain go into a certain state easier if you want to.
And so our brain has a bunch of these neurons in it, and that is what makes brain waves because the neurons are firing at each other at different frequencies.
Yeah, all the brain waves really come from the machinery inside a cell. The machinery inside a cell is just machines. It's machines that are making proteins and making fat and making microtubules and repairing membranes, but it's very small. And so it's very, very small, and so it will make different waves. Now, when the cell is repairing itself and it's making proteins and it's repairing its wall, it makes delta waves and theta waves. But when it's doing something very fast and it's processing information from outside, like, what did that news report say? Or what did that information say from, my friend talking to me? What does it mean? What are the implications of it? Then that's going to be beta waves and even gamma waves. So faster information processing is faster brain waves.
Mm,
Repair of the cell and restoration of the cell is slow brain waves. And that's why we call it sleep, because sleep is largely repair. It's the repair
mm.
and mechanism of making proteins and making fats and making structures inside your cell. So the little structures and machines inside your cell vibrate, and that literally is delta and theta waves. Those cells vibrating. It's the sound of them working.
Yeah, right. Okay, because frequency makes sound.
Exactly.
Yeah. Um, and I heard that our hearts make or produce 5,000 times more electromagnetic output than our brains. So would that mean that our hearts have like heart waves?
Oh, yes. Yes. There,
Yeah.
there's a whole science now where people are trying to integrate brain waves and heart waves together using heart rate variability and using EKG, where you have electrodes on your fingers or on your toes, and you pick up the heart's beats and you try to coordinate those with your brain. And that's definitely a stress modulation method that's growing in popularity, and it's very effective.
Oh my gosh, that's interesting. So our hearts ourselves are like little brains.
They are, and your guts are brains too. Your gut is your second brain. All your intestines might have more brains than a dog. Imagine that. Imagine an intelligent gut digesting that's as smart as a dog. And some dogs are smart.
Right. Wow. How do you define a brain? Is a brain defined as neural tissue or something?
Right now brains are it depends. Most of the definitions have been gray matter processing, where there's a bunch of gray matter cells that can integrate together and fire together and give each other information. But like ocean squid don't have the same kind of gray matter that we do. They have a lot of white matter and they have a lot fewer neurons. So, and they're quite intelligent. So the ocean squid kind of throws a monkey wrench into our modeling of what a brain is. If you didn't have the squid, you'd think, well, the bigger the collection of neurons there are, the bigger the brain, or the better the brain. So there's certainly animals that have bigger brains than us, like dolphins and whales, but they're not necessarily always smarter. Now, sometimes they are, and it depends on how you measure smartness, because there's many kinds of smartness.
Yeah.
But it isn't just size or number of neurons. It's partly what they do and how they work together. But the squid throws that whole thing apart because they don't have as many neurons, they don't have as much gray matter. They're mostly white matter with myelin, and they're smart. They're really smart.
Okay, so we don't there's not like a set definition for what a brain is.
No, we're still trying to figure that out, and yet we talk about AI like we know what a brain is.
But okay, so all in all, we have 3 brains in our body. Not just the head brain, but we have the heart brain and the gut brain.
Oh, and the spinal cord too. Don't forget the spinal cord is kind
Oh,
of its own brain. Yeah,
wow, okay, so we have 4 brains.
it's a lot like that. Yeah.
And, I hear mind, body, soul connection. Is that connecting, like, our brains in our body?
Well, I think so, and I've seen a lot of correlation between brainwaves and emotional states and people's personalities. Certainly, if you have to practice and learn how to see these things, but there are some real correlates between your brainwaves that you see on a screen on a tracing, these squiggly lines, and who you are.
Hmm.
It's not a perfect correlate, but it certainly does have a lot of overlay, and I think that it shouldn't be ignored. Now, we're not going to reduce ourselves to say that I am those brainwaves. That's not at all what I'm saying, but there is a real way that a lot of people can change. Like, for example, if you meet somebody whose baseline level of anxiety is kind of just high, and they get a brainwave study and they realize that their brain is technically normal, but it's just a little bit tuned too high, and they do some neurofeedback and it changes their life. There was no diagnosis, nothing wrong with them to begin with, but they were just tuned a little high. And when they do
Wow.
brainwave work, they come down a bit and they say, "Oh my God, I finally feel normal."
Wow. So that throws anxiety medication out the window. You don't need it.
A lot of times it can. Now, there's obviously a safety issue about what can be done, but I think that there's a real magnification of how much a crisis people are in when they're in schizophrenic states, or they have a psychotic break, or they have a massive anxiety or depression. The drug industry really wants us to think that they must be medicated right away for their own safety. And it turns out that the faster you medicate them, the more likely they are to hurt themselves and others. And that in the past, before drugs were invented that were psychotropic, that people would have these episodes and they would fade away. And we would treat them with things like ice baths and nutrition and sunlight and neurofeedback and ketogenic diets. Ketogenic diets weren't just for epilepsy; they were for other types of psychotic episodes and things like schizophrenia.
Mm,
And we're seeing lots more mental illness caused by toxins like pesticides, herbicides, heavy
yeah.
metals like aluminum, which is an adjuvant in vaccines. This is a real problem that we've got to pay attention to and not be
Yeah.
brainwashed and by fear told that, oh my God, as soon as anybody has a serious symptom, they must be medicated. That is
Mhm.
propaganda that's been fed by the industry because they're trying to scare people. And I think that really needs to be reexamined. And there's a lot of expert psychiatrists that are way smarter than I am that have talked about this, like Peter Gotcha and Georgia Eade. These are psychiatrists like Peter Bregan. These are all very famous psychiatrists that have talked about this issue and said you really shouldn't be brainwashed by these pharmaceutical companies.
Okay, and so the pharmaceutical companies, it's a power and money thing to
And
where
fear. It's
and
about fear
fear.
too.
What are they afraid of?
Well, they're trying to create fear in the public that says that, oh boy, if this happens, it's going to be terrible. It's going to be permanent damage. They won't be able to recover. They'll hurt themselves. They'll shoot other people. They'll go crazy. They'll suffer, and you won't be able to calm them down. And that certainly does happen in some cases, and there are things that can be done, and there are drugs that can be used, but looking at root causes and really getting to the core of what is the history, what is the toxic exposure, what is the dietary exposure, what are the genes and SNPs involved in this person, what are their stress levels, what do their brain waves look like, and there's so many more interventions that we can do, and it isn't a death sentence to have somebody have a psychotic episode or to
Mm,
have an event where they're just a little bit, they quote go crazy, or they have an episode where they're uncontrolled with either mania or depression or something, and they certainly need treatment, but they need root cause treatment, which is to figure out what's really going on. And I think that the fear that was built into society since those drugs were run by propagandists. They were run by advertising agencies and propagandists who were trying to create fear in society and retrain their knowledge of science. Because previous to that, our knowledge of science was that these things were not that serious and not that common, just like heart disease was not that common and not that serious. And the profession of cardiology didn't exist. And the profession of psychiatry, largely didn't exist the way it does now before medications were invented that were
mhm.
psychotropic.
Very interesting. And so you talked about schizophrenia earlier and all the like psychiatrical is that the word psychiatrical?
Psychiatric.
Okay, and all these psychiatric diseases. So
Yep.
what do our brainwaves look like whenever we're going through a schizophrenic episode? Or maybe even, high, like on psilocybin or weed. What
Well,
are
when
brainwaves look like?
when people are on weed or alcohol, they tend to have a lot of extra alpha waves And those extra alpha waves give them that feeling of feeling calm, and sometimes theta waves too, where they feel calm and relaxed and they can finally calm down. That's very useful for people that can't do that. Some
Mhm.
people can naturally and they don't need it. When you are on mushrooms, mushrooms do some things where they reduce the slow waves and they increase the fast waves, but they also decouple something called coherence. And coherence is how different brain areas talk to each other. So if this brain area is talking to this brain area and it's doing it too much, we get excessive coupling and excessive coherence. And we see that in things like ADHD and autism. On the other hand, when you take a mushroom or psilocybin, you have a reduced coherence because that kind of breaks apart all the communication of different parts of the brain and allows them to have kind of less of this dependence on other areas. So people tend to feel quite amazing when they get micro doses or even larger doses of mushrooms. And the risk is fairly low, except for in some families, there's an inheritable risk of having a psychotic episode from mushrooms. But generally, the risk of mushrooms is very less than most drugs, much less than most medications.
Yeah, so how would the desynchronization of our brain waves make us feel better or make us feel
Well,
good?
so the premise would be that the person entered that state of some kind of psychotic episode because they were hyper coherent. There was too much communication.
Oh,
Different cells were working together. It would almost be like watching a marching band. When you watch a marching band, every member of the marching band is in step. They're in phase. They're coherent. They're all doing the same thing. Their right arm swings forward, and then their left arm swings forward,
yeah.
and then they all turn their head, and then they all move their rifle or they move their instrument if they're a marching
Yeah.
band playing music, and they all do this. They do everything together, and
Mhm.
that would be hyper coherence. Now, if you think about it, you can't do a lot of work if you have hyper coherence, and that's the autistic brain, and that's the brain that's often in schizophrenia, where there's hyper coherence and there can't be much work done. I mean, imagine instead of a bunch of soldiers marching or marching band people marching, imagine that you had a room full of workers that were all at their desk working on some work for the company, and they were all doing the same thing. How much work would get done? Not much.
Just
Each
one
person at
thing.
their desk has to be somewhat coherent and know what the other ones are doing and be complementary and feed their work to the others, but they all have to do their own work. Because if they
Wow.
don't, there's no efficiency. The brain can't do its work. So there's this Goldilocks range of how much communication different areas communicate with each other. Too little is bad and too much is bad. And you'll find that both are a real problem.
Wow. What does too little communication look like?
So too little communication would be that all the workers are going off on their own. So that would be like now all of a sudden the marching band has no coherence and everybody just breaks and goes off in their own direction, right? They
Okay.
just suddenly just scatter like ants.
Yeah.
They scatter and they just go off in a different direction, one to his car, one to the football field, one to the restaurant, one to the bar. They all go to a different place and they're just
Yeah.
gone. There's no coherence at all among the marching band. Now, if the marching band, they might say, parade rest, but we're all going to walk together. Now the whole marching band is walking together and they're not coherent. Everybody's just walking the way they walk, and
Yeah.
there's no coherence except they're going in the same direction and they look somewhat similar. But if they're
Mhm.
marching in formation, now they're in hyper coherence.
Right.
And for a
Okay.
marching band, that's good, but for a brain, that's really bad because everybody's
Yeah.
doing the same work and no work is getting done because
Yes.
the brain's job is to process information. And so you're not processing information if everybody's processing the same information.
Right. And so not a lot of work would get done either way if you have too not enough coherence and too much coherence.
Either way.
But
Yep.
optimum coherence, would that look like the marching band, like all the different instruments playing the different notes, following the conductor,
Yeah,
all
it
working
would be
together?
like a halftime show where a group of them go off over here and they do something cool, and a group of
Mhm.
them split off and go over here and they do something cool, and it's interesting because a
Yeah.
marching band is boring, but a field show of a marching band is really interesting because you
Right.
got a group doing this and a group doing that and a group doing this over here, and then they're
Mhm.
waving flags and then they're playing music, and some are moving and some are still and some are swirling and some are up and down, and that interesting pattern gets work done. That is something that's interesting and cool. I mean, if it was the workers in the big room together, think of them all writing the same thing. They're all writing the same article, or they're all doing the same math table, or they're all working on the same thing. That's not efficient. I paid
Right.
all those workers to do different work in my
Yeah.
company. I don't
Yeah.
want them all doing the same thing at the same time. That doesn't give me any value.
Mhm. Right. When you're high off of shrooms or psilocybin, often spiritual experiences happen. Is that correlated between the sorry for what was the word again?
The
The
coherence, yeah,
yes,
very much
okay.
that coherence level. It's with mushrooms, it's a combination of that high frequency beta is firing, but there's also a decoupling of the coherence, and so people get this strange experience of having different thoughts at the same time, or these mystical experiences, and they're hard to explain because we don't really know what happens when you decouple the brain and different parts can fire differently. It's hard to explain, but we
Mm,
know that there's reduced slow waves, there's increased fast waves, and the coherence is broken apart somewhat.
okay. Interesting. And what about schizophrenic episodes? What would our brain look like then?
There's quite a lot of variation in schizophrenic episodes. A lot of them show excessive slow waves. Many of them show normal brain waves. Many of them show poisoning, metabolic poisoning where they've had heavy metal toxicity. Um, uh, some of it is related to carbohydrates and much like seizure disorders where there's excessive carbs. There's a wonderful doctor named William Walsh who's a biochemist who looks at the chemistry of schizophrenia, and he believes that there are certain biotypes of schizophrenia that are related to your mineral balance and your copper and zinc and vitamin B6 and your methylation status, which is to say how much you methylate given your B vitamins in your brain, which is a way of processing. Well, methyl groups have to do with the chemistry of your brain. I'll just say that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not I don't understand that. That's okay. About mystical experiences, are there parallels between brainwave activity during mystical experiences and near-death experiences?
Yeah, there are a whole load of people around the world that are trying to hook up people to brainwave devices and measure EEG and ERP and measure mushroom trips. They're measuring trips and they're measuring micro dosing, which is not a trip, and they're trying to show what happens in the brain. And they're also comparing that to near-death experiences. They're trying to hook people up at the time of death and see what their brain waves look like.
Mm,
So yeah, there's a lot going on in that world, and there are some parallels, and there's some real commonalities of what people see over and over and over again and feel over and over again. In fact, it may be in the future that if we can hook people up to brainwave devices, we can help them avoid a bad trip because some people have bad trips when they do mushrooms, and
mhm.
we might be able to have an essentially lucid tripping, like lucid dreaming. Lucid dreaming is where you can steer your dream consciously, and lucid tripping may be where you're on a trip with psilocybin or some other, ibogaine or something, whatever it is, and as you're on your trip, you can guide your trip and you can steer it more toward or away from mystical experiences or away from fearful things and not have some of the boogeymen that can come after you in some of those trips.
Right. And what is the difference between a marijuana trip and a psilocybin trip? Because psilocybin is psychoactive. What
Yeah.
is weed?
So marijuana tends to cause more alpha and more delta waves, whereas and increased coherence, whereas psilocybin tends to cause less delta waves,
Mm,
more beta waves, and less coherence. So you get quite a different profile of brain waves from psilocybin versus marijuana generally.
interesting. Okay. How do environmental factors such as exposure to electromagnetic fields change our brainwave activity? And what are some consequences of that?
Well, we're still figuring this out. There's a really good book by Dr. Joe Mercola that's called EMF'd. EMF'd. It's kind of hard to pronounce, but it's EMF'd. And that book is really good at explaining a lot of the exposure and the damage that happens to cells from electromagnetic waves. And it seems that his work, along with a famous doctor named Stephanie Seneff, who wrote all about aluminum and wrote all about glyphosate, which is Roundup. She wrote books on the subject and published information. She's an MIT trained engineer, and so between the two of them, Stephanie Seneff and Joe Mercola, and many other people, they've looked at the different ways that the brain is affected by EMF and electromagnetic waves, and it turns out that varying fields are much more important. And of course, that's exactly what our phones produce is varying electromagnetic pulsed waves. So there's a
Mhm.
pulse and then a silent, and then a pulse and then a silent. It's not a steady a steady radio wave. It's a pulsed wave where there's a burst of information where the phone is communicating to the tower, and then the phone is quiet, and then the phone bursts, and then the phone is quiet. That is much more dangerous for brains. The 5G frequency is much more dangerous for brains. And it turns out that the 5G frequencies, plus glyphosate and other pesticides, plus aluminum and other metals, cross the blood-brain barrier more easily. It turns out that these frequencies tend to make the blood-brain barrier more permeable. For some reason, that frequency makes the blood-brain barrier more permeable. And there have been fMRI studies that are functional MRI studies that show brain problems. There's EEG studies, there's brainwave studies, there's PET imaging studies and SPECT imaging, which is CT scans or X-ray scans of the brain and its metabolism. And there's other kinds called magnetic electroencephalography, where they use a giant magnet that's the size of a huge egg that comes down over your head, and it's a hyper cooled magnet, and it uses a magnet to visualize brain waves, which are even better than EEG and fMRI. And so that is another method called MEG, magneto electroencephalography. And that's very expensive. Only at universities do you have those machines. And all of those machines have been employed to measure the effects of electromagnetic waves and all these things on the brain. So it is a real problem. And the governmental agencies that regulate this have really ignored it. And it's our peril. We really need to go back and really study these things and understand what is going on with biological systems, with fetuses, with adults and children and pregnant women. It's really important to go and look at all of it.
So what do electromagnetic waves do to us? How do they harm us?
The vibration of the pulsed electromagnetic wave tends to break down the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier cells are usually very, very tight junctions. And when those cells receive inflammation or damage from those waves, they start to pull apart and they start to leak. And we call that in the gut leaky gut syndrome. And in the brain, we call it leaky brain syndrome. In pregnant women, we call it leaky placenta syndrome. You may see it in the breast when the breast milk produces more toxic milk, because normally the breast is quite a good filter. And sometimes mother's milk has more toxins in it because of these electric fields. So you really don't want these fields anywhere near a pregnant woman or a nursing woman or babies, or even, men that are trying to conceive. You don't want it to destroy their sperm. It's very important to look at all this stuff because it destroys cell membranes and it destroys the integrity of how cells stay together, and they wall out bad toxins and bacteria and viruses and heavy metals and of course pesticides, herbicides, solvents.
Okay, wow. So our phones are a very big problem. And we hold our phones so close to our hearts and maybe even on our stomachs, so
Yeah.
near the uterus. Wow, how scary. And some people even have their phone under their pillow when they sleep.
Yeah, we need our phones at least 5 feet away from our head at night and I would really turn them off. And then the other one would be they're not supposed to be next to our bodies or our head. They're not supposed to be here.
Uh-huh.
They're not supposed to be here. I see women tuck them into the bra. I see them
Yeah.
tuck them into a fanny pack or something.
Yeah.
And if you're gonna have them, you need to have some kind of shielding or some kind of phone bag that is away from your body, so it's not right against your skin or your hip or your ovaries. And I see that all the time, tucked in yoga pants. So we really don't want them next to our skin. We want them to be some distance away from our skin, and there's some layer of protection between them, like a Faraday bag of some kind.
How do brainwave patterns in humans compare to those in animals with complex cognitive abilities like dolphins or elephants?
Well, they have some of the same brain waves, and we do study dolphins, we do study dogs and cats, we study horses. There's quite a bit of research on animal brain waves and comparing them to humans. And in fact, you can teach dogs to communicate by pressing buttons. They can learn English, and they can learn other languages and press buttons and communicate
Yeah.
quite well. We're learning that the sensory perception of language is much better than the motor expression of language, which means animals may learn language and children may learn language, in fact, do learn language way before they can speak it. So babies know language a lot sooner than they can talk it. Just like
Mm.
when you're learning a new language, you can learn that language and hear it and understand it much better than you can speak it. And it
Right.
takes a lot longer to speak than it does to understand. So you
Mm.
can have some quite good knowledge of what people are saying, or animals could have quite good knowledge of what people are saying, but not be able to talk and not be able to necessarily speak. I mean, even ground squirrels and chipmunks prairie dogs, they have highly developed language. When I ride my mountain bike here in Colorado, there's a bunch of prairie dogs over there that are in a park, and they have highly developed language, and it's well established that they have alarm signals, and they have this is a friend signal, and they have, there's how many people are coming, they have how far away they are, all kinds of very complicated language that they communicate in their little barks and squeaks.
That's amazing. That's so cool. And also, you can communicate with animals as well emotionally, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's nonverbal communication, which is in humans the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere is verbal communication, and the right hemisphere is really nonverbal communication. Like when you
Okay.
walk up to a horse and you just rub it, or you
Yeah.
walk up to a dog and it just noses you. Those are nonverbal communications, and they're just as legitimate forms of communication as others. And in fact, someday when we meet aliens, we may need to understand nonverbal communication, and it
Yeah.
may be universal. It may be that nonverbal communication is fairly universal
Mm.
because if you look at people that swim with large whales and swim with dolphins and play with horses, it's the same. It's affection, and it's
Yeah.
it's it's contact, and it's touch, and you communicate the same way. It's the
Yeah.
same way that a mother whale swims with her baby in the ocean, and how she makes circles around it, and it's very loving kind of communication. And I think that we'll find that that is universal throughout the animal kingdom. And who knows, maybe out there too.
Yeah. What role do brainwaves play in shaping our perception of reality and spiritual experiences?
Well, I think they play a big role. I think that if your brainwaves are altered, you could have some aggressive tendencies that are not necessarily needed to be there, or you could have some perceptions that are faulty because your brainwaves are off. You could have a hyperactive brain that's so hypervigilant that you see everything as a threat. And so I think brainwaves play a big role in how we perceive our world and people around us. And if you can get control of them, sometimes you can have a much happier life, and the people around you might find you more pleasant, if you were one of those people that was, doing that kind of thing. And I think there are those that are, hyper vigilant or overly reactive, um, anxious brains, certainly.
Yeah. Okay, and so that's how like psilocybin works is because it's changing our brainwaves and therefore our brainwaves change our perception of reality.
I think so. And they
Okay.
change they change not only our perception, but they change our processing. So first of all, what are we seeing, and how are we seeing it? And then
Mhm.
what do we do with it? How do we process
Right.
what that means? And
Right.
that happens at every level. We process some of what we see and what it means in the back of our head when we see something. And at every level, all the way up from the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, to the frontal lobe, where the frontal lobe is the highest level of interpretation, where we actually say, what does it mean at a very great depth.
Mm,
If we're watching a play that's very nuanced, or we're watching a movie that's very subtle, or we're
mm.
listening to music that's got a subtle message, or we're listening to a politician that's very subtle, those types of things, we really need a good frontal lobe to figure out what is the message underneath. Poetry, if you listen to poetry, or if you read poetry, or if you read a novel, or if you read different speeches by famous people like Martin Luther King Jr., you'll see that there's nuance and subtlety in these speeches. If you read the old speeches by Roman emperors, there's lots of subtlety in those speeches. So that's really where the interpretation comes from, and the brain waves are a factor.
Yeah. So those people have very good myelin.
Yep,
Yeah.
those people have very good myelin. That's right.
Okay. So would listening to those nuanced speeches or reading these books written by people with highly developed prefrontal cortex, would that help our own prefrontal cortex?
Well, only if you do active reading and active listening. Sure. If you just
Uh-huh.
passively listen to it, it may be lost on you. But if you ask yourself, what can I get out of this?
Yeah.
What is the under message? What is the subtlety here? What is the subtle message? If you ask
Mhm.
yourself active listening and active reading questions, then yeah, you'll engage your brain. If it's too passive and you just listen to it, while you're mowing the lawn, you'll probably get less benefit than if you sit
Right.
with some piece of paper and actually take notes and
Mm.
try to think, is there double meaning here? How could this be meant differently? Is there some other way this could have been interpreted? And sometimes it helps to read something that was a speech, and sometimes it helps to listen to something that was in writing. Like if you read, letters that were written from people in historical days and you read it out loud, it has different meaning. And you're like, oh,
Mm,
wow, I think I understand what he's trying to say subtly here to his wife or to his friend or whomever.
yeah.
It's useful sometimes to change, what you're reading, what you're reading on paper to something spoken, and change something spoken to something written, and you'll see more and understand more of it sometimes.
Wow, okay, so you get more of, like, a holistic view about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you'll start to understand the layers and the subtlety.
How does electrical frequencies such as scalar waves improve okay, I gotta redo that question. How
That's
does
okay.
electrical frequencies such as scalar waves, including frequencies, improve health versus okay. How does electrical frequencies such as scalar waves improve health, such as the Schumann resonance?
Well, I don't know that scalar waves are applied to the brain as much as to the body. And so I don't
Okay.
know, the literature isn't very clear on
Yeah.
scalar waves in the brain, but scalar waves to the body are used all the time to heal organs and to make the immune system improve and all of that. And so the idea of scalar waves is a little bit complicated in physics. It has to do with the direction and amplitude of an energy. And I would like to say that the easiest answer is different frequencies and different carrier waves, because you can have more than one wave at a time. It's almost like hearing two or three people singing at once. The one
Mm,
person singing and the other person singing and the other person singing makes a chorus or a
mhm,
group. And so that aggregate sound is what the medicine is. And so scalar waves can be stacked on each other, or they can be made to resonate. And if they have a resonant frequency, they have that Schumann frequency, which is, like 7-ish hertz, which is the resonant frequency of the earth. And so there's some belief that if we can get into the resonant frequency of the earth, that we can have our bodies be healed and be healthy. And Tesla talked about that. He talked about the Schumann frequency range, which is like 7-ish hertz down in the
mhm.
in the essentially that is the upper theta, lower alpha range. But he also talked about 20,000 hertz and higher, and how that would be part of the resonant frequency of the earth and energetic fields too, and that those were healing and very, very
Mm,
useful. And so he talked about very high frequencies that were, in the megahertz range. There's a lot of different frequencies that can be used. To unpack scalar would involve a physics lesson, and I think that's probably too much. But
yeah.
scalar and vector analysis is a mathematical way that physicists analyze energetic waves, and it has to do with direction and frequency and intensity and um, like I said, I think that gets pretty complicated.
Okay.
One of the most famous people in the brainwave world is Yuri Kropotov, who's a Russian researcher. He's a physicist, and he is a physicist who studies brainwaves. In fact, part of his work in Russia was to take people where the skull was taken off of the brain, and
Mm,
that's called the calvarium, and they measured the brain directly without the skull, and that was Yuri's job. And Yuri's a very famous expert in EEG and ERP brainwaves, because he's one of the only people that have measured the brain directly without the skull in the way, like this model shows. This is what Yuri measured, because these people were
wow.
very, very sick, and in Russia they were trying to take care of them, so they went right in and devised some really cool neurofeedback methods to take care of
Mm,
them without drugs.
yeah. Were they alive? Of course they were alive because they had to measure the
Yeah.
brain waves.
Yeah,
Wow.
they were alive, and they would take this off, this part of the skull
Yeah.
off, and measure the
Yeah.
brain waves and put it back on, and then give the person therapies, because these people had terrible intractable diseases or damage or epilepsy or seizures or Parkinson's, and they did all these different things to try to help them and figure them out in the Russian healthcare system. And that was Yuri Kropotov, who wrote some of the best textbooks on ERP and EEG today. And
Mm.
in fact, he built the largest database of brainwaves for clinical use years ago.
Okay, so to end this, my last guest wrote a question down for you, for my next guest. And it was, when was the last time you laughed?
Oh gosh, right before this interview, absolutely, all the time, all the
Yeah.
time, absolutely, yes.
One of the things she talked about was how healing laughter is because it's our own voice's frequency, and laughter is healing.
Sometimes we'll ask patients to laugh in the middle of a EEG or neurofeedback session, and sometimes it'll help clear out their brain.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such a fun conversation.
Lily, what a
Well,
pleasure. Thank you.